Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar with Amélie Lafrance-Cooke. It's 3 o'clock, so we will get started. We will be discussing the use of the survey of financing and growth of small and medium enterprises data for economic research in the RDCs for research purposes. My name is Sarah Fortin. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Coordinator for the Canadian Research Data Center Network, the CRDCN. As you may know, the network is a partnership between a consortium of Canadian universities and Statistics Canada, now comprising 30 facilities across the country, including the CICS in Quebec, which includes itself 5 RDCs or branches at McGill, l'UQAM, University of Sherbrooke, University of Montreal, and Laval University. Actually, today's webinar is organized in partnership with the CICS, so that we have participants online and in person here in the office of the CICS in Montreal. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like just to mention that CICS is hosting its biannual international conference on migration this year, and this will happen this Thursday and Friday in Montreal, while the network is hosting its annual conference next week in Hamilton. So I invite you to visit our website to know more about these conferences, view the program, and register if you can join us either in Montreal or Hamilton. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. Amélie Lafrance-Cooke is an economic analyst at the Canadian Centre for Data Development and Economic Research, the CDER, which is part of the Economic Analysis Division at Statistics Canada. She holds a Master in Economics from Queen's University, and she has been working in the Canadian Federal Public Service for over a decade. Before joining Statistics Canada, she was working for Finance Canada. Her research interests are productivity and business dynamics, housing, income security, and wealth accumulation. Amélie will speak for about 30 minutes and will then take your questions. Note that all mics will be automatically muted during her presentation. So I invite you to, if you wish to ask a question, I invite you to please write it down by clicking on the question tab. If you look on the GoToWebinar screen, the control panel, you will see a question tab where you just have to click and then write down your question. I will read it for you when Amélie is done with her presentation. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our main partners, Statistics Canada, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and of course the universities hosting or partnering with an RDC. CICS is also supported by les Fonds de Recherche du Québec. So Amélie, thank you very much for being with us today and taking the time to present this pilot project. The mic is now over to you.
Okay, merci Sarah. So welcome to this webinar on using the survey of financing and growth of small and medium enterprises data for economic research in the research data centers. So my name is Amélie Lafrance-Cooke. I work in the Economic Analysis Division at Statistics Canada, which is also home of the Centre for Data Development and Economic Research. So this afternoon, in this webinar, I will discuss a little bit of how CDER, or Centre for Data Development and Economic Research, is a bit different than the research data centers. So I'll give you an idea about that. I will also discuss the survey that will be launched in the RDCs. And finally, I will give you some detail about the pilot project, what's required to submit a proposal, as well as the eligibility requirements. So as you may know, Statistics Canada is mandated to produce statistics that help Canadians better understand their country. In the area of social data, which you all know likely very well, Statistics Canada helped to create the Research Data Center Network. So there are now 29 universities that host NRDC, And in addition, there's also an RDC, as you know, in the headquarters of Statistics Canada. And these were established to address the need for professional assistance in carrying out work under the Statistics Act. So for the same reason, CDER, which is short for the Centre for Data Development and Economic Research, it was created to allow Statistics Canada to make better use of its business data holdings without compromising security. So CDER is really the only place where it's possible to access business microdata in Canada. So CDER was established in 2011, so still a fairly quite a new center, and it's available, or it's established in the headquarters of Statistics Canada to provide secure access to business microdata for approved analytical research projects. So in the Statistics Canada headquarters, where CDER is established, that's really the only place where you can access the business microdata physically. So you have to come to the StatsCan headquarters. And we have a number of clients that we serve. So we have about 30 Canadian and foreign academic institutions. And we also have a number of clients from 16 federal departments and agencies, provincial governments, and nonprofit institutions. So in the year that CDER was established, we had about 30 projects and 30 deemed employees or researchers. And fast forward to today, and we're up to almost 100 projects, which include 100 researchers. So there's been quite an increase in the number of projects that have been put in place at CDER. And it shows also that there's a big demand for using business microdata. So what kind of activities do we engage in at CDER? So CDER provides external analysts with secure access to business microdata for research-oriented projects that serve the mandate of Statistics Canada. And I want to really put some emphasis on research-oriented projects because it's very rare that CDER will accept projects that only want to look at tabulations, so at aggregate statistics. So we really try and give access only to projects that are analytical in nature, that use some kind of multivariate analysis, for example. CDER also serves as a repository for business microdata and leads the development of new business microdata. So we have a number of business microdata files within CDER. Some of them are administrative. So for example, we have a number of CRA files or tax files that we provide access to. And we also have a number of business surveys that we provide access to as well. So these tend to come from other divisions within Statistics Canada. And in terms of data development, we're continuously building new databases, and a lot of times this involves linking some of the business microdatabases. So for example, we've linked a number of tax files from CRA, and we've also linked a number of these files to some surveys, so some business microdata surveys. CDER also provides analytical consulting services. So for example, we provide custom tabulations upon requests, and some of these we often receive from other government departments or nonprofit institutions. And we also provide support to users of business microdata. So when we have a researcher come in and use the data, we provide ongoing support to them in regards to their project, their access, the vetting of their data, etc. So business microdata is a little bit more complex than social data in terms of the level of security. So we have to take additional measures to provide secure access to business microdata at CDER. So what does that mean? So unlike social microdata, units in business microdata are readily identifiable even without direct identifiers such as business name or business address. And that's because the distribution of business data is often highly skewed. So, i.e., it can be difficult to predict the identity of large firms. So especially when we're drilling down to a detailed industry, a detailed geography, it can become very easy to identify a business. So the example that I like to use is if you think of a business that's established in Quebec in the aerospace industry, you have an idea of which company this is. So this is just one example. This can be, identifying a business can be done across really multiple dimensions. So we have to take some measures in place to protect the identity of those businesses. Another aspect of why we need to provide secure access is that there are greater financial incentives to identifying the particulars of some firms and their competitors. So because we provide access to a lot of microdata files that contain financial information, again, it can be easy for researchers to identify businesses based on that information. So to address these issues and concerns, which has been raised by business respondents, we've adopted additional measures than those that are in the RDCs to protect the confidentiality of businesses. So what kind of measures do we have in place? So we do place a limit on tabular outputs. So as I mentioned, we typically only approve research-oriented projects. So we don't strictly produce, or we don't allow researchers to strictly produce tables that are not in relation to a multivariate analysis or to a regression model. But of course, there are cases where researchers will want to produce some descriptive statistics in support of their regression model. We have a form of centralized vetting. So we have analysts within CDER that will review the tables or the output that's produced by researchers to assess the confidentiality and to make sure that the confidentiality of businesses has been respected. And in many cases, for instance, when the researcher is using data that comes from or that's based on a survey of businesses, they often come from subject matter divisions. So we'll always collaborate with these divisions and we'll provide them with the tables that the researchers produce so that they can also assess whether the confidentiality of businesses has been protected. We also monitor the program logs. This is essentially, we try and check that there's no kind of phishing going on, if you wish, that researchers are not trying to continuously identify a business by looking at particulars of the data or of particular characteristics of the business. And finally, and this is where access is different than what's done or what's given in the RDCs, is the access to the data is through a Statistics Canada designed interface. So what that means is it's twofold. So one is that actual individual observations cannot be viewed, and that's because the data that we provide to the researchers in CDER is a synthetic data. So researchers can view this data and they can test their programs on the data, but to get results or tables or output using the real data, they submit their programs to the interface and they'll receive results pretty much like using the real data. And in this case, again, so the results are vetted by the analysts at CDER, similar to the RDCs. But again, this is what's really different at CDER. It's really access is only given to a synthetic microdata file. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. CDER is continuing to work to improve access to business microdata. So especially with our evolving business microdata linkages and all the new developments that we're doing in the area of business microdata, we need to provide adequate data documentation. So we're constantly trying to provide that for researchers, and that's specifically useful when they're using the data and also when they are submitting a project proposal. It's good to know what's in the data, the variables, and how the data has been constructed. We also try to respond to user feedback as much as possible. So we have kind of an ongoing relationship with the researchers once they're at CDER and using the data. So we're always consulting with them about how to better use their programs, make them more efficient. And we welcome their feedback at the end of the project and also throughout the project. So one of the comments that we hear, or the one comment I should say that we hear the most often, is that the cost of coming to Ottawa is a significant barrier to access. So if you think of, for example, a person or a researcher that's living in British Columbia, this person would have to physically come to Ottawa, by plane to use the data. They'd have to also find a place to live for a week or so to use the data. So this can be costly, and it takes time. So we often hear that this is a big barrier. And this is one of the reasons why we're introducing these pilot projects. It's really to make data, business microdata, available across the country. So the pilot project that I will discuss this afternoon is really, it's our second pilot project that we're launching in the RDCs. The first one was the synthetic longitudinal business database of T2 LEAP. So it's the T2 tax files that are linked to the longitudinal employment analysis program. So the call for proposals for that project ended in April, or at the end of April of this year. And we've evaluated the proposal, and so now we're currently preparing the data, and we're also preparing the access for the researchers. So a few weeks ago, Statistics Canada announced a call for proposal using the Survey of Financing and Growth of Small and Medium Enterprises in the RDCs. So this specific file that will be in the RDCs is a scientific use file. So I'll talk a little bit about that later and what that means. And this file is linked to CRA tax data. So again, it's our second project that we are launching in the RDC. So I'll give you just a little bit of information on the SFGSME dataset. So the dataset that will be in the RDCs is the 2014 data. And this survey collects financing activities of small and medium enterprises. It includes information such as debt, lease, the type of method to acquire financing, the characteristics of ownership, etc. And because it's a survey of small and medium enterprises, large firms aren't excluded. So this already lowers the risk of identifying individual firms. The file that will be available in the RDCs is linked to CRA data. So in this case, we include 17 variables from the General Index of Financial Information. So these variables are kind of those that are typically used by researchers using financial data. So you have your assets, debts, shareholders' equity, net income, revenues, expenses, etc. And for these specific variables, the data is available from 2010 to 2014, but only for these specific variables. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the file is a scientific use file. So what that means is that it's not a fully synthetic file like the T2 LEAP. So what we try to do is to make this file as much as possible have comparability analytically to the real data. So we employed a combination of methods from the disclosure control literature to make sure that the data is secure, but not by fully going to a synthetic file. So the methods we've employed, so there are three. The first is suppression. So we removed direct identifiers, such as business name and address. And we also removed some indirect identifiers, such as the geography, if it's smaller than the province, and the industry, if it's at NAICS level that's greater than 2 digits. So the only industry code available is the NAICS code at the 2-digit level. We've also employed some aggregation. So this was in cases where variables could be easily aggregated into groups. So for example, for the number of paid employees, so in the survey, the in this variable, there's a lot more groups. So we've essentially kind of made it into smaller, or not smaller, but less groups, if you wish. So the groups that are illustrated here are a lot more narrow. We've also employed some perturbation. So in this case, for variables that couldn't easily be grouped, we added some random noise. So for example, for the interest rate for a term on a loan, it wasn't easy to group the observations for that variable. So we added some noise based on a split triangular distribution, which means that we added really 5 to 10% of the original value to the observation. So we did this for about a dozen variables in the survey. So in terms of the tax variables, so tax data are highly sensitive and they require additional measures to protect the confidentiality. So to do so, in this case, we also employed perturbation. So we added some noise to all the tax variables based on a split triangular distribution. So for observations that required greater protection, such as like really large financial observations, we added between 10 to 20% noise. And for those that require less protection, we added 5 to 10% noise. So after employing those methods, we wanted to test the analytical validity of the scientific use data. So in this case, we looked at 3 different ways of doing so. In this first case, we compared some of the aggregate values that come from the tax data. So in this case, we compared mean annual assets between the real data versus the scientific use data from 2010 to 2014. So here, as you can see, aggregate mean annual assets for the 2 databases, they're pretty similar over time. We also looked at correlations. So here we looked at kind of 2 different ways of doing so. So in the first, we want to see whether the scientific use file maintains the existing relationships between variables. So in this example, we looked at the correlations between assets in 2010 and revenue, expenses, and net income. And we did so using both surveys. So as you can see, the correlations are fairly similar in both files. So if we take the example of the correlation between assets and revenue, in the real SFGSME, we have a correlation of about 0.307. In the scientific use SFGSME, the correlation is about 0.29. So the difference of about a little bit more than a percentage point. So the correlations are still fairly similar. We also looked at the correlations between the 2 files. So in this particular example, we took the variables used above and did the correlation across the files. So for example, using correlation of assets with the real and scientific use file, we get a value of about 0.99876. So it's really high. It's not equal to 1, but we wouldn't expect it to be equal to 1 because the files are different. But they're still highly correlated. And finally, we compared regression coefficients between both files using different regressions. In this example, we model the probability of obtaining financing on firm and owner characteristics. So here we use a multinomial logistic regression where the dependent variable equals 0 if the firm could not get financing. So that's the base case. Equal to 1 if the financing was not required, and equal to 2 if the financing was acquired. So here we compared the coefficients between the real data and the scientific use data, and we can conclude that the results obtained with the scientific use data are very similar to those obtained with the SFGSME. So to give you an example, so if we look at the owner's age, in the case of financing not required, so dependent variable equal to 1, the coefficient in the real data is equal to 0.185, and in the scientific use data, it's 0.184. So there's very little difference between the two. And in the case of dependent variable equal to 2, so that financing has been acquired, the owner age coefficient is negative 0.205 using both files. So they're identical coefficients. So I hope this gives you some reassurance that the scientific use file is very similar to the real data. So now I'll talk a bit about the pilot project and what we're expecting from researchers. So we've just launched a call for proposal a few weeks ago based on economic research using the survey of financing and growth of SMEs in the research data centers. So in the same light as projects in CDER, we require that projects focus on multivariate analysis. And these projects are expected to be carried out in the RDCs in 2018-2019. So to be eligible, the principal investigator must be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident of Canada. And to become a deemed employee of Statistics Canada for the duration of the project, so these are all kind of similar requirements that will be in place in the RDCs. All of the investigators will need to do a security screening. We require a letter of acknowledgement from the employer or academic institution. So this is just a letter from the employer or academic institution attesting that they approve the research project. And finally, we require that the oath or affirmation of office and secrecy in section 6.1 of the Statistics Act be signed. So this is an oath taken by all Statistics Canada employees as well as deemed employees. And in a nutshell, it states that no information obtained from the data or no identifiable information on a person or on a business will be divulged under any circumstances. So what's required in the proposal? So the first is the justification of the research. So if you can provide some context on the research, what are the issues that you're studying or that you'd like to study? What are some of the research questions? And how does your project contribute to the literature? We also ask for a detailed analytical framework and proposed methodology. Justification for using the microdata. So here it's simply stating that there's not really any other way that you can conduct your research project other than coming to the RDCs to use the data. We require some detailed data requirements. So as much as possible, listing what are the variables that you would like to include in your project. Specifying the location of the RDC where the data will be accessed. And finally, what's your expected output? So having a detailed descriptions of tabulations, even possibly the number of tables that you're thinking of taking out, and what are the regression models that you're thinking of studying. So having as much as detail as possible in your proposal will really help the evaluators assess your proposal. So this assessment is done by 2 academic peers, and it's also done by Statistics Canada. So the academic peers will assess whether there is scientific merit and viability of the proposed research. They will assess the relevance of the methods to be applied, and they will assess the expertise and ability of the researchers to carry out the project. So this part is typically done by reviewing a CV, the researcher's CV. Statistics Canada will assess whether there's a demonstrated need for access to the SFGSME microdata. So proposals will be accepted and evaluated on an ongoing basis until November 4th, 2018. So that's when the call for proposals will be closed. Okay, so in terms of how the access to the data will work, so the researchers will really, as in CDER, they'll have access to a scientific use file. So they won't be able to view the real data. So the researchers will develop models and SAS source data using the scientific use data at the RDCs. But the results from the scientific use data will not be released. So how's that going to work? So the programs that are error-free, once the researcher wants to obtain some results using the real data, the programs will be sent to CDER by the RDC analysts, and these analysts in CDER will run the programs on the actual data. So this will provide them with the results or the output using the real data. So the final results will be verified and released by a CDER analyst by email. So what's expected from researchers is a draft research paper by October 31st, 2019. And because this is a pilot project, we're really looking for as much feedback as possible on, the use of the scientific use, SFGSME, as well as on the documentation provided. Was it sufficient for your project, and the work environment. So how was your experience working with the scientific use data, and in terms of the interface, like how did it all work out for you? So because this information is going to help us develop our future pilot projects that we're currently working on. So we ask for as much feedback as possible. So that concludes my presentation. So I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amélie. All right, so now is the time for you guys listening by webinar to write down your question, please. Maybe we can start here in Montreal. Yes, please use the mic if you have a question and present yourself.
Merci, Amélie. I'm Carole Vincent from the KICS. So just in terms of timing, people who have this call for proposal was open,
That was a few weeks ago.
Okay, a few weeks ago. And so somebody has until November 4th to submit a proposal.
Yes.
How long do you expect? What's the timing in terms of getting a response
so
after submitting a proposal?
So some of that will depend on the number of proposals we receive. So once we do so, we'll evaluate them. So again, it has to be done by some academic peers as well as Statistics Canada. Once they're approved, then we have to go through all the security screening, which can take time. So we really expect to work to, like I put it says 2018, 2019, but realistically, it'll probably be more 2019 that access would be granted.
And the proposal for the first pilot project, how many projects were approved?
I'm not sure how many proposals we received, but I think about 8 of them, if I'm not mistaken, were approved. Yeah.
No. All right. Thank you, Carole. So I have actually several questions by participants online. Thank you all for your question. So let's start with Philippe Caboret asking, I would like to know if it is possible to merge SFGME to an external data set, on which level the merge could be done.
So for this pilot project, the answer is no. So it's really only the SFGSME linked to tax data that will be made available. But it's possible if you submit a research proposal to CDER to do so. So it would be a CDER project and not an RDC project, and you'd have to come to Ottawa to use the data. So in those cases, yes, it's possible.
All right. While you're mentioning, just to ask, when someone is currently submitting a project to CDER, are there any costs to these to actually access the CDER?
CDER, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So suppose it would do the merge here, there would be costs associated with this merging.
Well, it'd be part of the whole contract. So yeah, there would be kind of a total cost.
So is it cost recovery kind of service?
At CDER, yes.
Okay.
It's fully cost
So I think it's an
recovery.
important clarification.
Yeah, but for this the pilot is.
But the pilot is
it's
not,
free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And eventually, when the data set comes to the RDC, there would not be
It would
cost
not.
recovery according to your profile as a researcher.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Philip has a follow-up question. He's wondering if the SFGSME is a cross-section data or not a panel data, right?
It's not. No, it's cross-section.
Cross-sectional.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And then I will go with Joseph Raymond is asking, in the table comparing estimates using actual data versus data with noise, can you comment on the difference between the standard errors of the estimates? And then, do you know by how much the standard errors increased when you added the noise?
That's a good question. I don't have it here with the presentation. I can get back to the specific person because we do have documentation that really details the differences between the two files. So I can get back to them. I don't have it with me right now, but.
All right.
Yeah.
So Joseph, maybe you can write me an email to sarah.fortin@crdcn.org, and I will follow up with Amélie so then she can follow up with you afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then Mark Friel is asking, other than access through the RDCs rather than at Tunis pasture, is there anything different in the process than in a standard CDER application?
It's a good question. I don't think so.
Similar,
I think it's more like we're treating this kind of as an RDC project. So it'd be the same kind of, people would go through the same procedures as if they were applying to the RDCs. Yeah.
Thank you. Philippe Cabor, thank you very much for your presentation. I am Philippe. I would like to know if it is possible to merge SFGME to an external data. Yes, I did ask that question, didn't I?
Yeah, unless it's a different person.
Maybe it's, sorry about that.
Popular question.
Okay, so we've done that. Madiye is asking, where can we find more information about the available variables in the dataset to know whether it fits our research?
So those are the data dictionary was added to the call for proposal on the website on this. Again, I forget the acronym,
CRDCN website.
CRDCN. So it is available there. If you need any other information, so we put the CDER email at the end of the presentation. So if there's any other questions you have, please contact us.
Perfect, thank you. No. Okay, so I continue with a question online from Robert Snell. Will a list of successful research projects be posted publicly? Oops, I'm sorry, this is moving as people write questions. Just going back to, okay, will it be posted publicly, the successful project? And then it would be helpful to know who is researching what issues.
So to my knowledge, they won't be posted publicly.
That's actually something, thank you for mentioning, Robert. Possibly we could have an agreement with the CDER and the network so that we develop this page for the pilot where possibly the project could be listed.
Yeah.
So keep visiting our website to find out, and possibly it will be available when the call for proposal is done. Then that would be great. Thank you very much for the following up. Joseph Raymond is saying thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Philip again is asking, is there a way to visualize all the variables, including this SFGSME data? To visualize?
So in terms of a data dictionary? Or
I guess maybe it's similar. Maybe Philip, you can write a follow-up question to that. Did we answer your question with the data dictionary that is available online? Mehdi Bagheri is asking, so the researcher will receive synthetic data and start working online to build an analysis model in SAS or Stata only to check the result, and after that, to ensure the validity of the result and extent of changes in the result, the researcher is required to submit the SAS data code for running the code for the real data. Then, the researcher will receive the result from the run of their code on the read data from a StatCan. Is that so? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, it's exactly the process.
I think, yeah, that was a
Mehdi,
good
I
way to
hope
put it.
it's clear.
Yeah.
And then, so follow up here. So the researcher, no, it's just the same. He wrote it twice, I guess. Okay, thanks. So that's all I have online. Any follow up in person? And I have actually one comment regarding the first pilot with the T2 Leap. If you guys are interested by this other pilot project, we did have a webinar with Lydia Couture about that project earlier this year, and it's available on our YouTube channel, as this webinar will also be available afterwards if you wish to view it again. So I invite you to visit our YouTube channel. And I wanted to ask you about the real versus the scientific use files. Were the scientific use files developed for this pilot project?
Yes.
Or yes. So if someone wished to, despite the fact that you show that it seems to be valid and reliable, could we still, someone could still use the real files by going to Ottawa if they wish?
No, so we still, even at CDER, all the access that we provide is to a synthetic file. But you know, this is a pilot project, so again, we're trying to test the validity of the data.
Exactly.
And we are working in future, you know, in the next few years horizon, to possibly have real data available to researchers. But again, that's, you know, it might take some time to do so. But for now, it's only scientific use file or synthetic file that are available.
I understand. Thank you. All right. And Mehdi is asking about the YouTube channel. Well, it's very simple. It's called the CRDCN channel. So CRDCN as Canadian Research Data Center Network. Hope you find it. Otherwise, again, send me an email. I'll be happy to give you the direct link. And then I have, can it be an eViews code as well?
I don't think so. No, I think it's really, no, we strictly use SAS source data for these projects.
Right, thank you. So that's all I have online. Maybe a few more seconds if someone has a last question to ask. Here's the time to do so.
Or if you think of any other questions later, like please, you can email myself.
Maybe you can put again your address so people can.
So we have a CDER mailbox. Whoop,
So while you're doing this, I'd just like to remind you guys that we have our annual conference next week in Hamilton. We'll be more than happy to welcome you. It's still time to register. We have a great lineup of speakers and two outstanding keynote speakers, including actually who are Nicole Fortin from UBC and Matthew Mendelson from the Government of Canada. And we'll also have a special address by our chief statistician, Anil Arora. So visit our website to know more about the program and to register. And is there a last question? I don't see anyone. So here's the time to say thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come and attend this webinar. Thank you, Amélie, for taking the time to present your project with the CDER. And we look forward to the next webinar, which will be in November in French about the census 2016. So again, thank you all. Have a great afternoon.